Welcome back everyone, and in this video we are going to be making some nice little trees. And in this build for this model I actually use 4 different software. I use Substance Painter, I use Adobe Photoshop, Autodesk Maya and Autodesk Mudbox, and I probably could have achieved everything using just the single program, but having a workflow like this of moving between different software has certain benefits. One benefit in particular is I'm going to be making 4 variations of the exact same model here. Of course, the tree itself, and the different software allow you to be able to optimize the specific tasks in certain ways that then you can just simply repeat the same functions to speed up your workflow effectively. So to start with here, we're just in Photoshop painting some of the leaves, and again I want this very stylized painted art style where a lot of the shadows and the lighting are a little bit rough, but in the end on the tree itself, once the full picture is together, it still looks nice and refined and polished. So this small texture here, we're actually going to create 4 different leaves such that we have plenty of variation throughout the tree, rather than relying on a single leaf texture. And we're doing the inverse of the fern in this video, in the sense that we're having the lighter colors on the outside of the leaf in a more traditional way of building and painting a leaf itself. So now we've finished making the first leaf, we're just going to duplicate this over a couple of times and edit and change everything a little bit more. So that's what I start doing here, the same principle that I of course used to have that faster workflow while creating the fern in my previous video. And now that I've created a few more variations of the leaf, I create this simple little matte color palette, which is really going to add a lot more character within the tree and have this nice spectrum of colors. And as you can see, as I play with the hue and saturation here, I can quickly and easily change this if I want a more autumnal look, and because of the spectrum of colors that I've chosen here, it will still hold true. So now, having finished the texture map for the leaves, and then just quickly at the end there finished the height mapping, it's time to switch back over to Maya and start modeling this out. So we're creating just a nice scattered array of the leaves, and I'm making sure that there's no particular pattern here or recursion within the colors themselves, because we want to make a small object that then we can duplicate and rotate around to eventually create the entire surface area of the foliage of the tree. And this is a nice and simple technique that I use, and sometimes it can be a little bit polygon intensive, but through the modern era of computer games, this is certainly an acceptable move to create your more realistic looking well fleshed out and thick foliage for your tree set. And I make sure to create these leaves in different sizes, and I slowly rotate them around and generally create this overall circumference surface area. And it's a good feeling at this point when your hard work now effortlessly comes together to create the overall shape that you wanted. So we've got this surface area now of the foliage, and we start now creating the trunk of the tree. So we start with this simple cylinder, and we make sure to make it nice and thick and wide at the bottom and getting thinner as it gets to the top, before we start adding the bifurcations of the root system and then the branches. And I like to start with the roots at the bottom and then work my way up to the branches of the tree. So now we start haphazardly creating the bifurcations of the branches of the tree, and this initial model here that we're creating, this is not going to be the final fleshed out product. This model is going to be quite a messy stencil of a tree, and this is a technique that is often worth using for creating more complicated geometry, especially geometry if you want to sculpt and mold into becoming a more organic, natural shape. That you can disregard the efficiency of the shape initially, because what we're going to do here is build a basic stencil, a basic mesh framework, and from there build our improved upon, more polished tree shape. So all I'm doing here is I'm just simply subdividing and soft selecting vertices, and I'm just dragging them out and extruding until I have this general shape that starts to resemble a tree. And here we have the tree, and it's more of the shape that we want, but there's still a lot more work to be done, and there's a lot more character to be formed. Now, the basic equation that describes the structure of a tree is the structure of a fractal. And a simple equation of the Mandelbrot set, it is Zn equals Zn squared plus C. The equation is a self-replicating code. It equals itself plus chaos. It starts as a trunk, bifurcates into two branches. Each of those branches bifurcate, each of those sticks bifurcate and split into two, and so on and so forth until we have the mathematical fractal structure that we know as a tree. Now the sea is chaos. The sea is the wind, the sea is the rain, the sea is the direction of the sun. It is you sat under it. It is the deer that nibbles away at the bark. It is the snapped branch. It is all of the interactions, and that's what makes every tree significant and so special, is that literally stored within the tree is the touch of everything else in the rest of its environment. Literally, it saves the data. You can imagine if we had some supercomputer, you would be able to understand the exact conditions that produced that sea away from its initial equation, and within that data you would replicate you and everybody else in the rest of the world. And that's the beauty of chaos, and that chaos is what we want to now replicate within our artwork. So quickly now, I'm in Mudbox, and I'm using the sculpt tools in Mudbox to be able to create that more organic chaos geometry. But it does make the model a little bit messy. So that's the necessity now for going back into Maya and using the quad draw tool, which is simply a tool where we can subdivide and we can make the tree itself a live object now, that mesh, such that it is magnetic, and then any vertice that we create will follow the outline of the mesh itself. And this is what I said about using our tree as a stencil. Now, just look at how clean the geometry is here. Now this is getting closer to a game object that is, in my opinion, game ready. Now, I have played many games where I know for a fact they have not taken this step, and without taking this step you are wasting polygons, wasting calculations, and this ugly geometry is hard for the computer to use, this kind of topology, as well as the fact it's hard for the computer to calculate things such as collisions and how to render shadows and lighting with all of those polygons overlapping and vertices misplaced. And you are much better in having this more quadratic structure to your topology. And the process of doing this is quite time consuming. There is certainly no getting around that. But it's worthwhile. It's an efficient, effective optimization of your work, and it is just lazy not doing it. And this type of optimization is perfect for work such as on human characters and monsters and anything with more organic geometry. This is a necessary step to take. And if you look at the comparison of our original tree for the polygon count, where we had somewhere around 10,000 polygons in the original tree, and in the end our tree base here ends up only being around 3,000. So that's an impressive reduction for an object that actually looks the same quality, if not a little bit better. Now, the branches that I'm working on here, the branches themselves are actually probably one of the hardest parts of the entire model to apply this quadro tool method upon. And it's just a matter of just being patient and just slowly doing it. I can see why people tend to skip over this step, but it's such an efficient optimization that there really is not an excuse for not doing this when trying to create a professional, game-ready object. And I am of course going to be making a few variations of this tree also, and that's going to add to a lot of this time-consuming process. So now I start smoothing. So I use the soft select tool by pressing B on my keyboard, and I hold shift, and then I start just averaging out the vertices and smoothing them over the live mesh, which is of course the tree we built first time round, to create our second, more finalized version of the tree around that stencil. So let's quickly step forward in time rather than tediously watching me use the quadro tool, and move forward into when I start editing and creating some of the branches. And I make sure to add all of these little zigzags and gnarls and twists to make this tree look more aged. It's definitely got the structure of perhaps a hawthorn or some kind of moorland low-level tree, which is going to be hard weather-wearing and twisted and gnarled. And at this point we're verging on having that finalized game-ready release candidate for the tree, and with its clean geometry and structure and its optimized low level polygons, whilst also still looking HD and capable of withstanding with current generations of consoles and computer games. And we're going to smoothen some of the normal vectors such that it looks smooth and curved rather than these hard-edged polygons that you're seeing right now. And just extending the branches out and really reaching them through such that we can really make this tree look nice and fleshed out. So let's look at our work and how far we've got thus far. So this is the stylized effect that we're really wanting to go for here, that really represents the artwork and the art style that I'm creating for this puzzle game. And we can see the real shape of the twist in the tree, and we can imagine a story of how perhaps it began with some ivy growing around it at the bottom that sculpted and changed it. A tree born crooked can never grow straight, as the old saying goes. And I'm rather happy with the result here. And now let's quickly loop forward in time. Until, of course, now we have our 4 variations of the tree that I had created, because there's nothing worse than playing a game and it becomes incredibly obvious that you're seeing the same object replicated multiple times over. That's just sloppy games design. And I really want to emphasize just how clean the geometry is of each of these trees. And overall, each tree right now has around 7,000 to 8,000 polygons. That means that with a couple of optimizations, and say we reduce the texture size down to 32 and 64 by 64, at a push you could possibly render one of these trees on the N64. At a push. The N64 generally caps out about 3,000 polygons. So trying to put that into perspective for those of you who don't understand games development and topology, this is a very low polygon model, and we can have a lot of these through our game. So let's get back to work. So finally, moving away from Maya, after all of that topology, it's time to go back to Photoshop. And this time we're going to be painting a base texture in Photoshop of the wood of the tree bark itself. So my technique here is just to create lots of striations and lines up and down the canvas in a hue of 3 different colors, and then use the liquify tool to start to bend and curve and mold and merge those lines and shapes until eventually we get this rather authentic stylized wood looking texture. And I want the wood to appear quite smooth with lots of twists and swirls, and then we're eventually going to transfer this into Substance Painter to be able to use some of its generators. And the reason why we're doing this rather than painting it directly onto model itself is we don't want to have to go and repeat the workload we've done 4 times over. And now we are quite happy with our texture, we start adding some extra highlights and adding the magic, adding some strange colors and light reflections to make this look a little bit more fantasy-like and a bit more stylized. And there we have it. Nice and simple, effective little technique for creating wood. So now we import that texture into Substance Painter after we have set the UV maps of our tree. And then once the UV maps are set and laid out perfectly, we can start painting onto our object neatly. So now we simply add a new layer and add the wooden texture we painted in Photoshop as the layer. And of course I used the same technique that I showed you in the fern video and that I used with the leaves to create the height map of my original texture, and then I make sure to make the projection method triplanar. And we start playing around with some of the materials and the rotation and the direction and the size of the tiling map until we're at a point in which we're happy, before we start painting in some details and some shadows and highlights into the model. And a lot of this artistic flow is more experimental, and it's more playing around and changing in different effects until eventually you find the right kind of generator that adds the bumping and the dirt and the effect that you're looking for until you're happy. And that's one of the things I really like about Substance Painter and using this tool and working in this way, but also is the fact that once you've generated a substance, a material, you can then neatly project that material onto multiple objects without the need and necessity to use that much paint. And this wood material that I'm using here is a wood material I had created at a much earlier date, originally for the surface of tables and wooden chairs, but it helps me add some of the grain in the curvature of the direction of the wood around those swirls. And now, having gotten things closer to the way I want them, I start painting in some bump mapping and some height, and of course adding little swirls and runes and little shapes engrooved and cut into the wood itself. And they're only subtle. But this is the other great thing about Substance Painter, is you can paint bump lighting and height maps directly onto your model, which is one of the most useful tools with this. And now I start simply painting some of the shadows into the grooves to really bring out all of the curvature and the tones of the wood itself. And just changing the blend modes and how this all stencils in until eventually it looks more of a burn than it does painted shadows. And this really helps bring out all of the contrast and the shape of the wood rather neatly. So now that we've painted the shadows, we start repeating the process and giving some highlights, and this is going to help build the curvature of the wood itself, as well as a couple more normal maps to try and add a little bit more depth and bump mapping. So we can really see all those grooves and those cuts into the wood. A few more swirls and details here and there, as and where I think I can get away with them. And now the final step, of course, is just the highlights, that we're going to add white to start with, and then we're going to fade them in and change the blending mode options such that they're absolutely perfect. And here we are now with the finished product of each of the trees. All four of them slightly different, some of them with more distinctive features, such as the little splotches on the final tree here, compared with the heavy twisting, and different variations and shorter roots, and more twisted, gnarled roots. And overall, I feel like the colour palette here has really come together, and the variation of all of those stylized leaves in contrast with the brown of the tree itself. And of course, I can simply change the hue and saturation of these trees if I wish to change the season or the atmosphere within the scene itself. So let's zoom in now and look at a bit more of the detail within each tree, and the clean geometry that we strived for within this build has really come to a realization and come to life on all of the individual little leaves and the bump lighting and everything. And one thing I want to show you about the bump lighting is, of course, bump lighting and maps respond to the direction of the light. So if you look carefully here, you will see the small swirls appearing and fading and changing as the angle of the light reflects the geometry, or the fake geometry, the bump lighting itself. And overall here, I'm very happy with the result that we have achieved with each of these trees, and they're perfect to add a lot of character to the puzzle game, and the next step for this game asset will be to animate a little bit of a sway within the leaves to help simulate wind and motion within the game and really create that sense of submersion. So thank you everybody for watching this video, and I hope it's been useful to you, and I hope the entire series you're enjoying it thus far. Don't forget to give me a like and show your support. I'll see you next time.